The night sky over eastern Ukraine lit up like a second sun, not once, not twice, but dozens of times across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. When the smoke finally cleared and the damage assessments came in, military analysts around the world went quiet. What Ukraine had just pulled off in a single operational window was not just a battlefield achievement, it was a statement. A declaration written in fire that said very clearly, the rules of this war have changed. In the early hours of what would become one of the most consequential nights of the entire conflict, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated multi-layered strike campaign that simultaneously targeted Russian armored columns, ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, air defense systems, and forward command posts across multiple oblasts. The scale was unprecedented, the precision was surgical, and the message it sent, not just to Moscow, but to Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and every defense ministry on the planet, was impossible to ignore. But to understand why this single night matters so much, you have to understand how we got here. Russia began its full-scale invasion in February 2022 with an overwhelming advantage in raw military hardware, thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and aircraft, an arsenal built over decades designed to steamroll any opposition through sheer mass and firepower. For months, the calculus of this war seemed brutally simple. Russia had more of everything, and it intended to use all of it. Ukraine, by contrast, was fighting with legacy Soviet equipment, improvised logistics, and a desperate plea to the West for better weapons. Then something shifted. Slowly at first, then all at once. Western-supplied precision weapons began arriving, HIMARS rocket systems from the United States, Storm Shadow cruise missiles from the United Kingdom, Excalibur precision artillery shells, HARM anti-radiation missiles designed specifically to hunt and destroy radar systems. Ukraine didn't just receive these weapons, it learned to use them with a level of battlefield intelligence and tactical creativity that surprised even its most optimistic supporters. Ukrainian operators began combining commercial satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and real-time human intelligence into a targeting system that was lean, adaptive, and devastatingly effective. But this is where things become more dangerous. Russia adapted too. It hardened its supply lines, dispersed its equipment, dug deeper trenches, and threw wave after wave of infantry at Ukrainian positions in a grinding attritional strategy designed to exhaust Kiev's manpower and the West's willingness to keep funding the war. Russian forces also began deploying Iranian-designed Shahed drones and ballistic missiles in massive overnight salvos, targeting Ukrainian cities, power grids, and civilian infrastructure. The goal was psychological as much as military: break the will of the Ukrainian people, freeze them in winter darkness, and make Western publics question whether continued support was worth the cost. For a time, it seemed to be working. Ukrainian air defenses were strained to their limits. Power blackouts became routine. Frontline positions around Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and Robotyne changed hands at a terrible cost in blood. The war settled into a grim industrial rhythm that favored the side with the larger population and the deeper reserve of cannon fodder. Russian commanders, having absorbed the catastrophic losses of the early invasion, seemed willing to spend lives as currency, buying meters of territory at prices that would have been unthinkable in any Western military doctrine. And then came the night that changed the arithmetic entirely. Ukrainian military intelligence, working in close coordination with Western partner agencies, had been quietly building a comprehensive picture of Russian logistics across the theater for weeks. Every fuel truck movement, every ammunition resupply convoy, every artillery park that had grown just slightly too comfortable in its position, every air defense battery that had been operating from the same location just a few days too long. The picture that emerged was not just tactical intelligence. It was a master targeting list of extraordinary depth and detail. What happened next changed everything. In a window spanning roughly 6 to 8 hours, Ukrainian forces executed simultaneous strike packages using a combination of long-range drones, cruise missiles, precision artillery, and loitering munitions. The strikes were not random, they were sequenced. Air defense systems were hit first, opening corridors for the cruise missiles that followed seconds later. Ammunition depots were targeted with thermite-laced warheads designed to trigger secondary explosions that would burn for hours and detonate stored shells, destroying not just one stockpile but cascading outward through nearby supply chains. Fuel storage facilities went up in columns of black smoke visible on satellite imagery the following morning. Command vehicles were struck in the pre-dawn hours when Russian staff officers, lulled by the apparent quiet, had gathered for operational briefings. The numbers that emerged from damage assessments in the following days were extraordinary. Dozens of armored vehicles confirmed destroyed, multiple Buk and S-300 air defense systems eliminated, fuel reserves sufficient to sustain an armored offensive for weeks, gone in a night. Artillery systems that had been shelling Ukrainian towns for months silenced, and perhaps most significantly, at least 3 major ammunition depots destroyed in explosions large enough to register on seismic monitoring equipment. Russian mill bloggers, the unofficial but often surprisingly accurate chroniclers of the war, reacted with alarm that was impossible to fully censor, even through the fog of Kremlin-approved information control. The scale of the damage was too large to hide. Satellite images circulated across open-source intelligence communities showing enormous burn scars at locations that had, just days before, been active Russian logistics hubs. The visual evidence was undeniable. But here is where you need to understand something deeper about why this matters far beyond the immediate battlefield. Russia has been operating on the assumption that it can sustain this war indefinitely, that its industrial base, bolstered by sanctions-busting imports from China, Iran, and North Korea, can replace losses faster than Ukraine and its Western partners can inflict them. Every tank destroyed has, in Russian strategic thinking, been a manageable cost, painful but absorbable. The Kremlin's bet has always been on time. Outlast the West, outlast Ukrainian morale, outlast the political attention span of American and European voters. A single night that destroys a record quantity of that carefully accumulated hardware in one operational window is not just a military setback, it is a direct challenge to the entire strategic logic underpinning the Russian war effort. If Ukraine can do this once, it can do it again, and if it can do it again, the calculus of replacement and attrition begins to look very different in Moscow. For NATO, the implications are simultaneously encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because the investment in precision weapons and intelligence sharing is clearly paying dividends far beyond what many had expected. The performance of Western systems in Ukrainian hands has provided NATO with a real-world laboratory of extraordinary value. Data on how these weapons perform against Russian air defenses, electronic warfare systems, and hardened targets that no peacetime exercise could ever replicate. Defense ministries from Warsaw to London have been watching with intense professional interest. The sobering part is the question no one in Brussels or Washington wants to answer out loud. What happens if Russia, cornered and humiliated, reaches for something more dangerous? The Kremlin has, throughout this conflict, used the specter of nuclear escalation as a form of strategic blackmail. Each major Ukrainian success has been followed by renewed, barely veiled threats from Russian officials and state television personalities about what Russia's arsenal ultimately contains. So far, these threats have been bluster, but military planners are paid to take worst cases seriously, and the worst case here requires no elaboration. China is watching all of this with the cold, calculating attention of a government that understands it is observing a preview of potential futures. Beijing has studied how Western precision weapons and satellite intelligence degraded Russian armored capabilities. It has drawn conclusions about the vulnerability of large vehicle columns to drone swarms and long-range precision strikes. It has quietly upgraded its own air defense doctrines and its development of electronic countermeasures. And it has continued very deliberately to walk the line between supporting Russia economically and avoiding the kind of direct military assistance that would trigger Western sanctions on Chinese industry. Meanwhile, in Washington, the debate over Ukraine funding has been loud, fractious, and at times deeply uncomfortable. But the strategic reality that even skeptics acknowledge is this: the cost of what Ukraine is destroying in a single night of combat, equipment that Russia spent billions acquiring over decades, is a fraction of the price of what the United States would need to spend confronting a Russia emboldened by victory. Every Russian tank that burns in a Ukrainian field is a tank that will never roll toward a NATO border. That arithmetic, cold as it is, has kept the weapons flowing, and the weapons keep getting better. Ukraine has now demonstrated the ability to strike deep into Russian-held territory with a precision and volume that was simply not possible 18 months ago. Long-range drones developed domestically by Ukrainian engineers, operating on improvised budgets, working in basements and garages under air raid sirens, have struck targets inside Russia itself, including oil refineries, military airfields, and radar installations hundreds of kilometers from the front line. The psychological impact on the Russian public, accustomed to being told the war is a contained special military operation, far away, has been significant and growing. What Ukraine has done is develop what military theorists call a deep strike capability from scratch under fire against a nuclear-armed adversary. That is not a small thing. That is historically remarkable. The night of the record strikes will be studied in military academies for years. Not just for the tactical execution, though that execution was impressive by any standard, but for what it reveals about the evolution of modern warfare itself. The age of mass armies grinding against each other in set-piece battles is giving way to something faster, more networked, and far more lethal at range. The side that can see further, process information faster, and deliver precision fires at greater distance is winning. And on this night, Ukraine demonstrated that it has built that capability to a degree that nobody fully anticipated. But wars are not won in a single night, no matter how spectacular. Russia still holds significant occupied territory. It still has enormous reserves of artillery ammunition despite the losses. It still commands a population and industrial mobilization that Ukraine simply cannot match in raw numbers. The road ahead remains brutally hard, and Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches know it better than any analyst sitting in a studio thousands of miles away. What this night does is change what is possible. It narrows the gap. It forces Russian commanders to rethink every assumption about the safety of their rear areas, their supply lines, and the permanence of their logistics architecture. It tells every soldier in a Russian armored vehicle that the distance from the front no longer guarantees safety. And it sends a signal to every government watching this conflict that precision, intelligence, and the willingness to be creative and ruthless in the use of modern weapons can offset the brute advantage of mass. The fires from that night are still burning in the satellite images. The black smoke columns have drifted east. The secondary explosions from burning ammunition dumps have finally gone quiet. But the shock wave, the strategic, psychological, geopolitical shock wave, is still traveling. It has reached Moscow, it has reached Beijing, it has reached every NATO capital and every defense planning office where serious people are trying to understand what the future of warfare looks like. It looks like this. It looks like a single night that changes the math of a war. And somewhere in Ukraine, the planners are already building the target list for the next one.